Now, something I spent a lot of time talking about in all my other courses, and I do mean a lot of time, is the effect of the socioeconomic status of your family of origin when you're still young and living with them, as well as when you're an adult independently living on your own, the lasting effect of your family of origin. There is no way possible for me to overstate how important the socioeconomic status of your family of origin is in regards to how you are likely to perform academically at school. There is a mountain, an indisputable connection of evidence between the socioeconomic status of a student's family and their grades. The connection is there, and it is not small. It is significant, it is strong, and it is consistent across time and ethnicity and religion and anything else you want to throw in there. This is why a student's socioeconomic status is treated as its own issue, apart from the effect of their parents regarding effect on education. Now, there's also a direct connection to the highest level of education they're likely to complete, in addition to how well they do in school. This doesn't begin in adolescence. It doesn't begin in childhood. The origins of this go right back to infancy and even prenatal care. Whether we're talking about basic academic skills taught in elementary school or the higher order thinking that's required in junior high and high school, a student from a lower socioeconomic status is likely to have much more difficulty than a student from a higher status, and their academic achievement or lack thereof demonstrates this. Why? Well, without exaggerating, you could take several full courses based just on this. Your family's socioeconomic status, usually referred to in layman's term as their social class, affects an enormous spectrum of factors that will likely have an effect on academic achievement. The higher your social class, the more likely your parents have more education themselves and thus have a better paying occupation themselves. And this creates advantages for you in several ways: nutrition, healthcare, mental health care, early childhood developmental advantages that in turn lead to later developmental advantages. Simply put, a family of a higher socioeconomic status can provide its children more of everything in every way, not just in material goods. Even the manner in which you're parented tends to be affected by your parents' socioeconomic status. Families who are not of a lower status are much more likely to be authoritative in nature and to be actively involved in their children's education. This is in part because they're more likely to have an occupation that allows them to be more involved regarding actual time, and also because since they usually have more education themselves, they tend to be more comfortable in an educational environment. They're familiar with it and they're used to navigating it. Lower status families are simply much less likely to have all of these advantages and more. Now, again, this is not absolute. There are always exceptions. But the fact is, for the vast majority, this is a situation. If you come from a lower income family, you will have more obstacles when it comes to obtaining a good education. Obstacles that come from various sources from a variety of directions. So we've looked at factors inside the school environment that will affect academic achievement, factors outside the school environment that will affect academic achievement. But what else could we look at? Well, we also have the students themselves and individual differences, and I've already alluded to some of them. By individual differences, I mean things about the students themselves. So even just looking at ethnicity, I've already talked about the fact that Asian American adolescents had the best academic performance of any ethnic group in American society. And as you can see, they're followed by people who are white or Caucasian, African American, and Latino. Some similarity with Canada, because in Canada, Asian Canadians tend to have the highest level of educational attainment, while First Nation Canadians tend to have the lowest levels. And this is due to several things. It's not just one or two factors and that explains the whole thing. Sometimes this is due to cultural differences. And these cultural differences might include different overall beliefs about parenting and educating and education itself. How much education is really valued. Um, you know, in different cultures, they tend to allow their adolescents to spend more or less time with their friends. And also in terms of culture, if we look at First Nation Canadians, for example, they have had to deal with hundreds of years of discrimination and racism and blatant attempts at genocide. Genocide is the attempted elimination in whole or in part of an ethnic group. And that is exactly what the Canadian government spent years trying to do. So this is not something that First Nations can recover from in a few decades or within a single generation because it has a lasting generational effect. Cultural differences may also exhibit themselves in terms of who or what is thought to be responsible for academic achievement. So what I mean is that, as pointed out in the text, Asian parents very commonly believe that if a student performs poorly, it's because of a lack of effort, not a lack of ability. So there's none of this, well, some people are naturally academic or not, or some people are academically inclined or not. That's not the way they see it. Instead, it all has to do with effort. So the solution is always for a student put in more effort. Simple as that. And it's not the teacher's responsibility to motivate them or their parents' responsibility to monitor them. It's the responsibility of the student to put in more effort. That's the solution. So if your parents believe this and then you get a poor grade, it's on you. You need to put more effort into your studies. Your parents will not just accept a poor grade and insist in more effort from you. The issue of cultural differences can also play into other factors, such as one I just mentioned, how much time you're allowed to spend with your friends. Because remember, because of selective association, we choose friends who tend to be similar to us. So if you're Asian and your family has very traditional beliefs regarding education, that will affect your attitude and your perception, and you're likely to be friends with people who are similar. With this in mind, it's not surprising that Asian Americans are most likely to have academically oriented friends. Adolescents and other ethnic groups, for them, the influence of their friends will be different. So ethnicity is always something to keep in mind when we think about individual factors affecting academic performance. Another individual difference is gender. And in the past, the general discussion about gender and education has always been focused 100% on girls, on increasing opportunities and achievement for female students, on how to encourage girls to focus more in math and science, on making sure they would have the same educational opportunities as boys and gain the same education. But this has now completely changed. The focus is now on male students because they have fallen behind female students in every subject at every level. Boys are now much more likely to have a learning disability. They are much more likely to have been held back a year. They're much more likely to drop out of high school. They're much less likely to have goals for themselves in terms of their education. They're less likely to attend a post-secondary institution, and if they do, they're less likely than the female students then to graduate from them. And this has absolutely nothing to do with differences in intellectual ability. It has everything to do with gender. Ever since a structured education system first emerged in North America, women have been fighting for the right to the same quality and amount of education as men. They actively fought for it and advocated for themselves. And now the situation is totally switched. And all of this is true, not just in Canada and the US, it's true for every single Western country. Why? Well, let's look back to socialization. In general, socialization leads to female students being comfortable in and enjoying the school environment more. Because in general, girls are still socialized more to be settled, to be quiet, And these are traits that are very, very compatible with an educational environment. Um, this is a natural fit with the school environment. Boys are still generally socialized to be very rambunctious, which does not fit well with an educational environment. So because of this, girls are more likely to have positive experiences in school, and boys are still more likely to have somewhat negative experiences in school. So we as a society have absolutely come a long way towards gender equality and not differentiating gender as much, but we still do it. There's still a significant difference as a whole in our expectations for how girls and boys behave, for what is expected of them. And this contributes to the difference in academic achievement between male and female students. Now, tied into the general differences of socialization between boys and girls, for whatever reason, your text makes the point that adolescent girls are more likely to feel supported by their parents than other adults regarding their education. Now, this one's not quite as straightforward, and your text really doesn't provide much of a possible explanation for this. Since I spend a good portion of my working life talking about gender, I'm going to give you some ideas. Is this because, on some level, males in our society are still expected more than females to be capable and independent and adept at looking after themselves? Whereas we still have this underlying current that is somewhat traditional, that females need looking after in some way. So that parents on some level feel like their sons are more likely to be a go-getter and look after things, but their daughters should have more support and supervision. Which again, leading back to how boys and girls are socialized overall. I don't know, it's just an idea. Now, what I find a little strange about all this, and I'll speak about this in some other courses as well, is that even though female students have not just caught up to male students overall, but surpassed them in every way, and girls are now just as likely as boys to take math and science in high school, is that as emerging adults, women are still less likely to choose math and science fields to major in college and university. You would think with all of this change, more and more women would choose to major in math and science fields, but that's not the case. So does this come back in some way to women still being largely expected to be the nurturers in society? And because of this, again, and in part because of differential socialization? I don't know. I also find it really, really odd that there's no great public outcry about male students slipping so far behind, like there was with women fighting for an equal education. You know, there are some books, and there is some recognition of this out there, that the achievement gap has not just been deleted, it's been eliminated, but that now we have a very real concern, or we should have a very real concern about educating boys. But it's just been kind of passively received. We just don't have this organized, alarmed response from adult men, and the same way that we had an organized, alarmed response from adult women about educating girls. Okay, now let's start to wind it down a bit. There's two more main issues I want to speak to you about in particular regarding this chapter in the textbook. Adolescents who don't finish high school, and for those who do, they take a year off or two before going on to post-secondary education, known as a gap year. So looking at people who drop out of high school, the term high school dropout has not always been in existence. In fact, it didn't emerge until the 1960s. Why? It's actually very simple reasons. One, that up until that point, it was not automatically assumed that all teenagers would graduate from high school. Because prior to the 60s, maybe into the 50s, graduating high school was not a normative experience for adolescents. And then second, tied into this, you could not finish high school and still find a half-decent job, so that not finishing high school was simply not as big a deal as it is now. And by half-decent job, I mean not living paycheck to paycheck, being able to afford a house and look after your children well, being able to save for a comfortable retirement. You wouldn't be wealthy. You probably wouldn't be vacationing every single year out of the country and getting a new car every year, but you could afford a comfortable life for yourself and your family without going to high school because you'd be able to get a job without that diploma. This is now completely changed in two ways. The first is that graduating high school has become an expected normative experience. These days, it's not, oh, they didn't finish high school. What are they doing? No, it's, oh, they didn't finish high school. What happened? It's automatically perceived that there was a problem because it's an expected normative experience. And tied into this, our entire economy has changed. We are no longer predominantly a manufacturing economy. Instead, we are an economy based on knowledge and services. And because of this, it's no longer likely that you're going to get a half-decent job without a high school diploma. In other words, your occupational prospects are going to be much, much more slim. And when you do find employment, you're going to not make very much money. It's likely going to be a lower paying service job because the necessity of having at least a high school education has risen so much. Now, we're lucky in Canada that the number of people who don't graduate high school here is relatively low. Although you'll see here, there is quite a bit of difference between the provinces, and I'm going to show you the territories in a second. And you know, the number of people who don't graduate high school has clearly been declining. So if you think the first column, just look at Newfoundland and Labrador, 19.9% between 90 and 93, 7.4% from 2000 to 2010. So feel free to pause this and take a look at this a bit closely. And again, this next one's going to show you the provinces a second time, but it also includes the territories, and that's why I included it. You've got the territories in the bottom three slots here, the bottom three bars. You'll notice that graduating high school is much, much less likely in the territories in Canada. Now, none of it has not been its own territory for a very long time. It doesn't even have a standardized curriculum firmly in place yet. However, also for the Northwest Territories, the NWT and Yukon, it's still quite low. And just to give you an idea of what the situation in the States is, I included one for the States as well. So, you know, look at 90% and above graduation rate is green. I thought there'd be a heck of a lot more green on this map, I'll tell you. You know, this is the United States. It's an industrialized, advanced country. I was very, very surprised that their overall graduation rate was not much better. Now, of course, the best way to try to drop the dropout rate, the best way to lower the high school dropout rate is to figure out, on average, why do people usually not finish high school? And then try to eliminate that reason. But the thing is, when somebody doesn't finish high school, it is very, very, very rare that it's because of just one reason. It's usually the result of a variety of factors in their life. I mean, I'm sure it happens sometimes, but you know, it's not very common that somebody just wakes up in the morning and says, yep, I've had it. I'm not going to go to high school anymore. Instead, it's because of several contributing factors. Yes, it is true that when an adolescent drops out of high school, they are much more likely to have a certain educational history. That's not a myth. Whether that's a history of behavioral problems and or a history of not doing very well academically in high school, or a combination of these two things. We know that adolescents who drop out of high school are much more likely to have repeated a grade in the past. So again, they weren't doing well academically. So in other words, kids who drop out of high school and don't finish have a history of negativity, a history of negative school experiences. And you know, human nature, what it is, we like to avoid things that are unpleasant. And if the majority of your experiences in an academic environment are unpleasant, whether that's academically or socially, then you're going to want to avoid it. But what about these students themselves? We've already talked about individual differences in students that can affect academic performance. But what about looking specifically at kids who don't finish school? Well, we know that if a student is struggling with a learning disability, they are much more likely to drop out of school. Why? Because of everything I just said. They're more likely to struggle and have difficulty learning. And by the time you get to high school, this is going to be much, much more noticeable because academic placement in high school becomes much more noticeable. And school is much more likely to be a negative place for them. Another reason why somebody might drop out of high school is something we spoke about in a previous chapter, and that is teen pregnancy. So here are a couple of those ads from New York City Public Health. We know that having a child puts a teenager at a much higher risk for dropping out, especially the girl. That's a fact. We know that teenage parents very rarely stay together as a couple, and rates of dropping out are higher in single parent families. And in turn, if you as a parent don't finish high school, your children are less likely to finish high school as well. So there really is a generational effect here. Parents who do not graduate high school are much, much more likely to have children who don't graduate high school for a few reasons. One theory is that when parents don't have a high school diploma, this indicates to their children that on some level they don't value education as much, that they have a lowered expectation for their children, and this has a strong influence on their children. Parents without a high school diploma will likely have a lower paying job and live as low income, which in turn contributes to the likelihood their children will also drop out as a family with a low income, will live in a low income neighborhood with poorer quality schools and fewer resources and less qualified teachers, all contributing to a more negative school experience. Just the different experience of living in a low-income neighborhood compared to a middle or upper class neighborhood will also have an effect on the tendency to drop out, because the environment of the neighborhood is likely to be more stressful. In another class, I talk about something called chronic activation theory, which is very, very common in low-income schools, meaning that kids live in an environment that is not as settled, and school is an environment that is settled. So when they're at home in a low-income neighborhood, they're used to this chronic activation, to things always going on. For them, things constantly going on is the norm. So when they go to school, whether it's elementary school or high school, and they have to be settled and quiet in the classroom, that's not the norm, and they have trouble adjusting. So this is something else that is going to affect whether or not a child will drop out of school. Now, you don't need me or the text to tell you that not getting a high school diploma is negative. Not just in the moment as an adolescent, but it's going to have lifelong negative consequences. A high school dropout is much more likely to have financial difficulties and only be able to obtain a low-income job, and this will continue their entire life. I've already mentioned more than once the generational effect in families, and people who drop out of school are more likely to have difficulties with substance abuse and with depression. Now, these are not guarantees. I can't say to you, if you drop out of school, I can tell you exactly what your future will hold, but they're very, very strong likelihoods. Dropping out does predict a variety of future problems. It just does. There's no getting around it, which is why there are so many so many programs whose sole purpose is to keep students from dropping out of school. Not just because it's the right thing to do morally and socially speaking, but because of the increased difficulties faced by young people who never finish high school. And it's also taxing on society as a whole. It's taxing on our society's social programs and financially. So this is why specific efforts are made to target students who are more likely to drop out of school. And research has pretty clearly indicated that there's very, very specific things that are needed to prevent kids from dropping out who are more likely to do so. And the first comes back to that school climate. that what these kids need, who have a higher tendency to drop out, is a really positive school climate with teachers who truly care about them and who recognize that their job is going to involve more than teaching, but they're also going to be like miniature social workers a lot of the time. In order to keep these kids in school, we know that it really helps to have a low student to teacher ratio, which is going to contribute to creating that positive school climate overall, and is going to help students feel like their teachers really care about them. And something that may surprise you is the third thing that research indicates is that all of these efforts need to be started way before high school in at least grade 7, if not earlier. Because by the time the student gets to high school, they're going to be so far behind academically speaking, and they're going to have had so many negative experiences that it's going to be much harder for them to catch up. So that it's really, really important to provide particular resources for students that are likely to drop out of high school as early as possible, at least 2 years before they actually start. So just to wrap everything up, again, note that you don't need to learn the information regarding tertiary education, college, university. I'm not going to really talk about post-secondary education too much, but I am going to talk about something that some students in the world commonly do after high school, and that is a gap year. A gap year is very, very common in Europe, and all this means is taking a year or two after high school instead of just immediately continuing with your education. That's all it is. And we don't have this very commonly in Canada. In fact, here, only about 2% of students take a gap year or two. And I guess I have my own perspective on this because I'm working with students all the time. I think if anybody was asked, how would you like to take a year or two to travel after high school? I'll bet you 99.9% of us would say yes. If that was an option for me now, I would say yes. But of course, this is not possible for most of us. And when you look at this in the text, it lists the most common reasons for high school graduates to take a gap year or two. None of them are really far out. And yes, earning money is often cited as a reason for gappers. But if you look at this list, to me, the first thing I thought is, yeah, that's great, but quite clearly, a lot of the things that people are doing on this list, they must have financial support somewhere. And as somebody who works every year with a few hundred students, I can really see how having a gap year between high school and post-secondary would be really, really beneficial for a lot of students. In my experience, and yes, I absolutely recognize this is just my experience, I'm not talking about well-rounded research. At least half the students I encounter are attending university simply because they're expected to be there, not because they themselves really want to be and because they've really thought it out. And this is also true in speaking with other faculty. They don't have a really strong personal desire to attend university as something that's really important to them. They're there because it's what's expected of them by their parents, and because these days it's simply what you do. You go to high school and then you go to university. Because our society as a whole is fixated on degrees, everybody wants their kids to have a university degree, even though it's no longer a pretty automatic guarantee of a job when you finish university like it once was. There are college and vocational and technical schools that provide education and training that will enable you to make money, more money than with a degree, but society as a whole is fixated on degrees. I see lots and lots of examples of students, and I can see this from what they say when we're talking, that tells me they're in university and they don't have a specific or even a general occupation in mind that they personally want to train for. Even though they see how much they spend on books and tuition and living expenses, they don't fully grasp how much that's going to add up to by the end of the degree, or perhaps more importantly, how long it's going to take them to pay it off. Yet across the board, in speaking with students who have taken a year off, or maybe a couple years before they go to university, even if they had to do this in order to afford to go to university, they had to work, they have all said they found it really worthwhile in making them think in a more mature way about what they want to study, as well as being more careful about going into debt and even taking more care in the courses they select. So they have a whole new perspective on what their major will be, on what courses they'll select, about taking courses online and in the summer to get their degree done quicker. They really do have more direction in terms of what they're doing in their education and more personal motivation. So let's just pull this all together. This chapter has covered a wide range of topics. Some of the issues mentioned you could probably identify with, and some you've had no experience with at all. But what they do collectively is help to explain why certain educational outcomes are more or less likely to occur depending on where a person lives and thus their culture. Now, as I've already said, how our education system differs from that in another country or another part of our own country is not something we usually ever think of because we just don't have a need to. But it is worth thinking about the exact same thing and how it's approached differently in another country, and why we approach education in the way we do here, because in doing that, we can consider what improvements might be made.